Good afternoon, Mr. Actenhead. Could you please read, perdón, en español? Sí, perdón.
Good afternoon. ¿Podría, por favor, leer la declaración?
Declaro solemnemente por
I solemnly declare from my honor and conscience that I shall speak the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Muchas gracias.
Good afternoon, Mr. Eichenhead. How are you today?
bien, gracias.
Very well, thank you.
Mr. Eichenhead, you have before you the statement that you have rendered in this case. First is just, can you confirm that that is your declaration to this tribunal?
Sí, se trata de mi declaración.
Yes, this is my statement.
Tense before the tribunal? Yes. Do you ratify the contents of the declaration before this tribunal?
Yes, I do. Everything that's written here is correct. There is just one thing. When I wrote the information regarding my public post, I made a typo, and I was the Minister of Finance and of the Economy in Guatemala from 91 to 94, not 1990.
Thank you for that correction. Could you just briefly describe for the tribunal your public service record in Guatemala?
My public service career started in 1991 in January. I was the Minister of the Economy in my country. I was the Minister of the Economy for 4 months, and in the new administration, the Minister of the Economy, the Minister of Finance stepped down, and the President asked me to go to the Ministry of Finance, and I was the Minister of Finance for 3 years and 8 months. I was charged with coordinating the economic cabinet and everything that had to do with macroeconomic policies, the negotiation of the internal and foreign debt of the country, and the management of public finances. In 1994, I retired and I went back to the private sector, conducting activities in the private sector. And in 1996, the new president asked me to be involved in the negotiation of the peace agreements. Guatemala was negotiating the peace agreements with the insurgent armed group after many years of armed conflict, and I was a member of the negotiating team for a year. And then on 29 December 1996, the peace accord was signed in Guatemala, and then I went back to the private sector again. And in January 2004, Oscar Belge, the president-elect, asked me to coordinate the plan of the government, and I was appointed government commissioner to work together with the ministry, and I was there until January 2008. After that, I went back to the private sector.
In your capacity as presidential commissioner under the administration of President Oscar Berger, did you have access to the president on a weekly basis?
Well, yes, definitely. The idea was for me to assist the president in coordinating the social and economic issues that were part of the economic plan. I met with the president 3 or 4 times a week. Sometimes we had lunch together. and I participated in the general cabinet meetings of the government and in the economic cabinet that was coordinated by the vice president, this under Guatemalan law. The vice president was Mr. Eduardo Stein.
Did there come a time when the president asked you to become involved in disputes in between FEGUA and Ferrovías in relation to the railway project in Guatemala?
Yes, in January 2006, in March 2006, the president asked me to make up a commission of high-level officers to negotiate with Ferrovías the different issues that had to do with the operation of the railway in Guatemala. Because of the activities that I was involved with, I suggested to the president that Mario Marroquin be the one involved in the negotiations. He was the adjunct commissioner. He participated in those meetings actively, but I was kept abreast of the moving forward of the meetings in the period the meetings took place between March and May 06. Later on, I was still involved in them. I was more actively involved in this until the end of that year.
And we're going to get to that in a second, but what was your, to your understanding, what was the purpose of the formation of the high-level commission that you just described?
There were disputes that had expanded between FEGUA and Ferrovías. In 2006, there had been an internal arbitration process, and FEGUA had not made payments to the trust fund, so conversations were around that issue. On the part of Ferrovías, there was a little bit of a malaise because of people settling in areas of the railway, and the state was seen as someone who had to do more activities in order to prevent that. And the idea was for the railway in Guatemala to work in full capacity, connecting the cities with the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast, and the government wanted to push forth the rehabilitation plan, and also there were legal defects related to a contract signed in 2003 related to the railway assets and also the rolling stock that were the property of FEGUA.
And to your understanding, was the purpose of the high-level commission to help resolve all of those disputes that you just testified about?
Well, the precise instructions of the president were as follows. I am interested in the context of the competitiveness program and the development of the country to have a working railway system, to have a better logistics as a country, to have imports and exports that are transported via the railway with more competitive costs. And this was my priority within these 8 points that President Berger had in his government plan. That was his main purpose. Then there were other purposes, such as finding a solution to different disputes that FEGUA and the Ministry of Communications had, and the company, Ferrovías. The president told us at all times that this negotiation had to be in good faith and that the result of this negotiation should be positive for all involved, and above all for us to get an efficient railway system in Guatemala.
Now, there came a time toward the end of that year, I'd say in August of that year, where the president signed an executive resolution declaring the equipment contract lesivo, and ultimately that executive resolution was published in the official gazette by the president's staff. To your knowledge, why did the president take that decision?
As I recall from that time, well, the overseer of FEGUA talked to the Secretary General of the President and said that in his understanding, the contract executed in 03 failed to comply the requirements set forth in Guatemala law, and the contract's deficiencies should be cured, because in the way which it was operating, it generated harm for Guatemala. So legal studies were conducted, and the president always tried to find a negotiated solution to any dispute, including this one, but there was a deadline by which he had to declare lesivo. If not, he would be personally responsible for any problems arising from that contract. Given the situation, in August 2006, the executive resolution declaring lesividad was published. Lesividad of the contract was published.
To your knowledge, Mr. Eichenhead, was there a point in time earlier in that year when the president took the decision to suspend or stop the process to declare that contract lesivo for a period of time?
Yes. I recall this on the basis of information given to me by Mario Martin and because of communications that I had with Commissioner Fernandez, that in May 2006, during the negotiation process, there was a meeting where it was said that this lesivo declaration was being circularized amongst the ministers, and that seemed to be an act of bad faith in the context of the negotiations that were taking place. There was a request, and Mr. Fernandez talked to President Berger, and he told him that it was important for these negotiations to go on for the approval of lesividad to be suspended. Mr. Berger was ready to suspend them, saying, however, that the negotiations were to go on, but there was a deadline, and if there was no cure to the defects in the contracts, he would be forced to signing the lesividad because he didn't want personal responsibility in connection with those problems in Guatemala.
After the executive resolution was published, the executive lesivo resolution was published, could you describe for the tribunal what involvement, if any, you had in attempting to reach a settlement of the problems that had occurred between Ferrovías and FEGUA?
Yes. After August 06, the president asked us again to try and move forward and to negotiate and try to find an acceptable solution for all the parties involved, a solution that would solve not only one aspect but all of the aspects related to the railway projects in the country. Now, I held some conversations with the local partners of Ferrovías in Guatemala, and we insisted to them, objeción.
None of these post-lesivo declaration discussions are described or referenced in his statement.
His statement, yes, I'm sorry. his statement refers to the fact that the president asked him to be involved both before and after the Lesivo resolution in dealing with these issues. And this goes directly to allegations they've made about what has happened post-Lesivo.
So the witness should answer the question, and is beyond that, the time is over for the direct. Please go ahead.
Bueno, como venía señalando,
As I had already mentioned, the president asked us to continue. We had a couple of meetings, and the local partners hired an investment bank in Central America called Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica is a leading investment bank, and they conducted a study on the railway system in the country, and they presented that at a meeting and expressed their doubts about the viability of the system without strong investment. Upon conclusion of that meeting, in which I participated at the beginning, but I did not stay throughout the meeting, the president asked me for follow-up. I talked to the local partners, and I was asked whether I could meet with Mesoamerica directly. With Commissioner Fernandez, I had several meetings together with Mesoamerica, and around November 16th, 17th, 2006, they approached us at our offices, made a presentation, we discussed it with them, and we established the basis of an agreement to present to the president on November 20th. They held consultations with, that is to say, Mesoamerica, with the local partners, and they also had consultations with the international partners, and on Saturday,
His witness statement. This is completely new evidence.
I
It has
agree.
nothing to do with his
I
testimony.
agree. Let's move on. Please have the cross-examination.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Eichenhead. We have some documents in a binder that's being handed to you that I'll be asking you some questions about. Now, as you answered in your direct testimony, in response to Mr. Horta's question, you testified that on average you would meet with President Berger on average about 3 to 4 times a week. Is that right?
es correcto.
that is correct.
Is it fair to say that you were one of President Berger's closest advisors during his term?
I cannot qualify how close I was, but I was an important advisor to the president.
Okay, fair enough. Now, according to your statement and your testimony today, you insist that the government always negotiated in good faith with Ferrovias both before and after the issuance of the Lesivo Declaration, correct?
That is correct.
In, well, you don't dispute, and according to paragraph 11 in your statement, that the government was only willing to stop the Lesividad process against the equipment contracts if Ferrovias and the government had reached an agreement that would have provided not only a cure for the alleged legal defects in the equipment contracts, but also a plan that would ensure the rehabilitation and functioning of the railroad on the South Coast Corridor, correct?
What I can confirm is that the main objective of the President of the Republic was for the railroad system to work properly. And as part of that solution, specific problems had to be solved, including the use of equipment and fixed assets that were the property of FEWAS for under usufruct to Ferrovias.
Okay, well, I just want the record to be clear. Let's look at paragraph 11 of your statement? Do you have that in front of you?
Lo tengo enfrente mío.
Yes, I have it here.
Okay, and I just want to be clear. The statement you submitted to the tribunal here was written in English, correct?
Sí,
Yes.
Okay, you didn't submit a Spanish version, right?
no.
No, I didn't. Yes. But I always had people who helped me on drafting and style. I can communicate in English or Spanish. I am doing it in Spanish because this is the official language of the country I represent.
Okay, thank you. Now, again, I just want to be clear. In paragraph 11, I'm looking at the third sentence of that paragraph, and I'll just read it here. It says, quote, had the parties reached an agreement that would have provided for the cure of the legal defects of the equipment contracts and for a plan that would ensure the rehabilitation and functioning of the railroad, the government's desired and ideal outcome, the La Cividad process, could and would have been stopped. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And that's a true statement, right? The parties had to reach an agreement with the government that not only cured the legal defects in the equipment contracts, they also had to agree to a plan that would ensure the rehabilitation and the functioning of the railroad in order for the government not to declare the equipment contracts lesivo, correct?
That was the general intention of the government.
And in fact, the next sentence in your statement says, because this did not happen, the parties did not reach agreement on both of those points. The president declared lesivo of the equipment contract, correct?
That is correct. The government did so for those reasons and to avoid personal liability.
Okay, we'll get back to the personal liability question in a little bit. Now, again, just to make clear what your testimony is, it is true, is it not, that the government would not have been willing to stop the La Cividad process against the equipment contracts if the government and Ferrovias were only able to reach an agreement that cured the alleged legal defects in the equipment contracts, correct?
Correcto.
Correct.
And it was your understanding that the alleged legal defects in the equipment contracts were two things. One, the lack of a public bid in the awarding of that contract, and the lack of presidential approval of that contract. Is that right?
One of the main points considered by the president was that that contract had been published has been offered without the approval of the Council of Ministers. That was the main issue. And second, the bidding process. There had been a bid in 1997 that was confirmed in 1999, but in 2003 they were still working on the basis of the one issued in 1997.
Okay. So those were the two defects: the lack of presidential approval and the lack of a new public bid for those contracts. Correct?
Based on my knowledge, that is correct, but the person in charge of advising legally, the president is the Secretary General and not the person who is in charge of advising him on financial issues.
And it's true, is it not, that at no time did the government, to your knowledge, ever make a standalone offer to Ferrovias, either before or after the Lesivo Declaration issued, to stop the La Cividad process by curing these two alleged defects in the contracts, correct?
I don't have information on that, and as I mentioned it before, I was not sitting at the high-level negotiating table. That was Mr. Marroquí who was there, and I do not have any knowledge that they were able to discuss specific items rather than general ones.
Well, again, my question just was to your knowledge, and I just want to confirm it. To your knowledge, the government, no one from the government ever made a standalone offer to Ferrovias to stop the Lesividad process against the equipment contracts by curing the two alleged defects in the contract, the lack of a public bid and the lack of presidential approval, correct?
Based on my knowledge, I don't know whether they did it or not.
You never, as one of President Berger's close advisors, important advisors, I think you said, you never recommended that President Berger put the equipment contract to a new public bid, correct?
Back then, I did not suggest what you are saying.
And you never recommended to President Berger that he approve the equipment contracts. You know, he and his cabinet ministers approve those contracts, correct?
I'm going to object just because this witness has already testified that those were issues that were under the competence of the Secretary General and not his competence. So he's asking him questions about which he would not have been advising the President to begin with.
This is clearly
Mr.
within the
Stein?
scope. Excuse me. This is clearly within the scope of his testimony. He's discussed about the reasons why the president declared Lesivo, and he was advised about these things. He says he knows about the defects. This is clearly within the scope of his testimony, and he can answer the question whether he did or didn't, you know, without any problem. It's a perfectly fair question.
The witness should answer the question.
Would you please repeat the question?
Sure. My question was, you never recommended or urged President Berger to approve, he and his cabinet ministers to approve the equipment contracts, correct?
What equipment contract?
This is equipment contracts, the ones that were declared Lesivo, sir.
Are you referring to the contract after the declaration of Lesivo?
No, I'm talking about the Ferrovias equipment contracts, which President Berger declared Lesivo because, for among other reasons, the contract lacked presidential approval. Do you understand which contracts I'm referring to?
Yes, but those contracts, when signed, should have been approved by the Council of Ministers in 2003.
That's fine, but my question was, once you learned about the lack of presidential approval being one of the defects of the equipment contracts as grounds for the Lesivo resolution, you did not advise or urge President Berger to approve those contracts, right?
No, I didn't.
Now, isn't it a fact that the reason President Berger issued the declaration of Lesivo was not because of any legal defects in the equipment contracts, but because Ferrovias had not invested a sufficient amount of money to rehabilitate the South Coast Corridor?
No, that is your own speculation. The president insisted that we needed to improve the operation of the system, and we also needed to solve the old problems and how we could move forward with rehabilitation phases 2, 3, 4, and 5 as stated in the contract, and Ferrovias never made a proposal as how phases 2, 3, 4, and 5 were going to be conducted.
Okay, so weren't you aware that there were reports at the time after the declaration of Lesivo was published stating that President Berger said the reason he declared Lesivo is because Ferrovias had not made a $50 million investment in the South Corridor?
The president never indicated that to me at any of the meetings that I attended or at any of the cabinet meetings.
The question was, were you aware of reports in the press, in the Guatemalan press, about such statements by President Berger?
Now I don't remember, but it would be impossible for me to remember what the president said at one point in time, given all the statements throughout his administration. But Commissioner Fernandez, as far as I know, never mentioned that information that you mentioned to the president about the president of the republic.
Okay, again, my question just was not about what you may have heard from President Berger directly or from Commissioner Fernandez, but were you aware of public press reports about President Berger stating that the reason he declared Lesivo was because Ferrovias had not invested $50 million to rebuild the South Coast?
I object just because that question's already been answered.
I don't think he has answered it.
The answer is right in the record. He has answered it. I'd be happy to read it. Yeah, sure. The answer, I don't remember, but it would be impossible for me to remember what the president said at one point in time, given all the statements throughout his administration. But Commissioner Fernandez, as far as I know, never mentioned that information that you mentioned to the that you mentioned to the president and about the president of the republic. I'm not entirely sure that that's 100% accurate as to what he said, because I was listening in Spanish. But nonetheless, it's answered. But if he wants to ask it again, he can, because I don't think that transcription of what was said is accurate.
And again,
why don't you please, if you know the question, if not, it should be repeated, and go ahead and answer.
I'll try a fourth time. Again, my question is not referring to any statements you may or may not have heard from the president himself or from Commissioner Fernandez or anyone else in the government. My question was, were you aware of public reports, newspapers, TV, radio, etc., which reported that the president had stated that the reason he declared Lesivo was because Ferrovias had not invested $50 million to rebuild the South Coast?
I don't have any recollection of that piece of news that you're mentioning.
Okay. If those reports existed, would that surprise you?
If they were reports, internal reports by the government, documents by government officials, I would be extremely surprised. If this is a report by a journalist in the press, the Guatemalan press says a lot, I wouldn't be surprised. But if there was a public document, I would be extremely surprised because I never knew of it.
Okay, well, let's look at Exhibit C-131, which is tab 4 in your binder. Do you have that?
Sí, aquí lo tengo.
And this is
Yes, I have it here.
this is a article from Diario de Central America dated September 5th, 2006. I just asked you a question. Is this, just wanted you to confirm, this is a September 5th, 2006 article from Diario de Central America?
Yo no lo puedo confirmar porque
I cannot confirm it. I read it, but how can I confirm that?
I don't know if you were looking at the English translation or not, but if you look behind, there's a blue page and then the original in Spanish. Go next page. Do you see that?
sí lo veo.
Yes, I can see it.
Diario de Centro America, that is the official Gazette of Guatemala, correct?
It is the newspaper that belongs to the state, yes, to the government.
Published newspaper, correct?
It is a newspaper published by the journalists that are employed at this at Diario de Centroamérica, and that belongs to the government. Those are two different things.
Newspaper? Is that a yes?
Correcto.
Correct.
And you consider this to be a reliable source of information, don't you?
En términos generales, sí. No puedo saber si
It is in general terms, but I cannot know whether this topic in particular is correct, but it is a journalistic source.
Consider it to be a reliable newspaper? That was my question.
no creo que no me estén.
I don't think you're understanding me. I said that even though it is a reliable newspaper, I cannot guarantee that all the information published is correct. I can only guarantee that I do consider it a reliable source of information.
And indeed, the government published the declaration of the Cividad against Ferrovias' contracts in this newspaper, correct?
That is the second role of the newspaper. There are two roles to the newspaper. First, to inform about news in Guatemala, and the second one is to be the vehicle to publish any agreement or decree by the government of the Republic. But these are two parts to the same means of information. The official part is the declaration of the governmental agreements, and the journalistic portion have to do with the news.
Okay, now looking at the article that is cited here in Exhibit C-131, and do you have that? I'm looking at the third paragraph, and it states here, Berger explained that the declaration of the Cividad arises from the fact that the $50 million investment under said contract did occur. However, he added, Ferrovias has a 90-day term to enter into dialogue with the corresponding authorities. Does that refresh your recollection or any news? You saw any news reports at the time, shortly after the declaration of La Cividad was issued, that President Berger declared La Civo because of the $50 million investment was not made?
It doesn't help me remember, but it does help me see a publication by the press that makes that announcement. That's all I can say. I do not remember reading that article.
Okay, let's look at Exhibit C-133. Which is at, I'm sorry, tab 5 of your binder.
Okay.
Okay, and the English translation's at the beginning, and like the other tab, the original's behind, if you want to look at that. So Exhibit C-133 purports to be a September 8th, 2006 article from La Hora newspaper. Is that right?
Sí parece,
Yes, it seems to be the type of art. It seems to be from La Hora.
Just going to ask that the witness look at the Spanish version because it appears that the English translation is not accurate.
Yes, feel free to look at the Spanish version. And again, I would point out in this article, it again states the president says the first sentence, the president, Oscar Berger, considers that Ferrovías does not have the $50 million funds required to carry out railway operations in the country. I believe they do not have the financial capacity to do what needs to be done, said the president. His statement was given after a meeting with representatives of Ferrovías to discuss the issue. The president expressed his concern regarding the corporations lacking financial resources. We do not intend to cause any harm. If they come to us saying they will invest $50 million and then I see works being carried out on the broad gauge railroad, they will have our support. So again, you were not aware at the time of these types of news articles, this news article and others reporting on President Berger stating that the reason he declared Lesivo is because the $50 million investment had not been made in the South Coast.
That's a complete mischaracterization of this article, so I object to that characterization of the article. It speaks for itself, and it doesn't say what Mr. Stern just said.
Well, let me just ask you a question. You were not aware of this article at the time in September 8th, 2006, correct?
I don't remember it. I think that what I see here is very consistent with what the president said, that is that the railroad system had to work fully and that progress had been made along the line going to the Atlantic, and they wanted to make progress along on the Pacific line. And based on what I see here in the article, it is important to mention that Ferrovías had stated that it was not, that the railway system that they were using was not profitable, and also the study by Mesoamerica concluded that $300 million had to be invested as opposed to $50 million, and that was the conclusion of the study in November. And we wished that $50 million would have been enough.
Okay. If the president demanded that Ferrovías had to invest $50 million in the South Coast, in order for the government to withdraw the Declaration of Lesividad, in order to withdraw the Declaration of Lesividad, would you consider that to be the negotiating good faith by the government?
That assumes facts, not in evidence. There's no evidence that the president ever made that declaration to Ferrovías or anyone else.
I'm asking him hypothetical based on multiple news reports that are in the record.
He's not an expert witness.
I'm asking, he's expressed a strong opinion that the government always negotiated good faith with Ferrovías.
Sorry, that's an improper question. This is not an expert witness.
I guess we need an expert on good faith.
The witness should answer the question.
con mucho gusto.
I'd be pleased to do so. The only thing I can say is that the president, through the 4 years that I worked there, always had good faith in this and other negotiations. He always expressed that, and it seems unusual to me that a comment in the press is given more importance than any discussion that might have had. I don't know if this statement was ever made by some member of Ferrovías or if it was made elsewhere, because in the Economic Cabinet and the General Cabinet meetings, I never learned of this request of having to invest $50 million.
That wasn't my question. My question was, if the president said or demanded that in order for the government to withdraw the declaration of lesividad against the equipment contracts, Ferrovias would have to put up $50 million to rebuild the South Coast Railway, would you consider that to be negotiating in good faith by the government?
Con todo el perdón,
With my apologies to the tribunal, I have no reason to interpret hypothetically what a press statement by the president says. I can make reference to the orders that I received from him and the discussions that we had, and he always displayed good faith with me. I cannot hypothetically say whether this means something other than good faith. I apologize, but you'll have to ask someone who has heard it firsthand.
So you can't answer my question, sir? Is that what you're saying?
I cannot get into trying to interpret what you want me to interpret. You can interpret what you will. I cannot answer. I cannot answer your question in the terms in which you'd like.
Okay, let's look at Exhibit C-132, please. And this is a video. It's not going to be in your, It's an audio recording. It's from a radio broadcast. So you're going to see it on the screen and listen and hear it. Yes.
For the record, before you play it, could you say the date of the...
Yeah, there should be. I'll have the date
Okay.
when we show it. Do we have a date on this? What's the date on it? The date of the broadcast is September 8th, 2006.
I'm sorry, before a question is asked, I have several objections. Number one, I couldn't hear a word of that. So it's very difficult for me to formulate further objections based on what just was done. Number two, there's been no authentication of this audio that's been just played, who was on the tape, who's reporting this, how it was made. I just have a complete objection to any line of questioning in relation to this audio.
Before you
Mr.
decide,
Stein.
can I ask the witness a question to see if he could understand it?
Yes, I couldn't understand
Yeah.
it, and I'm a native Spanish speaker. But maybe it would be helpful to know the origin of it, I mean the source, and
Sure.
perhaps to have a transcript. I don't know whether one of the exhibits is a transcript. that he has.
There is a transcript in Exhibit 132, which is on the screen here,
Okay.
and it's a broadcast from El Independiente, September 8th, 2006.
And according to you, Mr. Stern,
Yes.
This is the president speaking?
Yes, that's what the broadcast purports to have.
Can I just point out that the transcript, which we have no ability at this moment to verify whether it's an accurate representation of what the audio says, states in the first 3 lines, 4 lines, 5 lines that there's a number of unintelligible things that apparently were said that were not recorded. So, I mean, I just object to this entire line of questioning based on this document, or this audio, and this transcript of the audio.
Well, I would point out that they've had this broadcast and transcript for quite some time and have never heard any objection about it.
Right, but this
But-
is the first time you're using it as evidence in this proceeding.
I think it has been used as evidence since you have it.
I meant in this proceeding, I mean during the hearing.
Well, but that many things have been used in this hearing that are not, I mean, you had them long before. Most of the things, except what you agree last week, there are certain exhibits at the last minute that we added to the proceeding. The rest has been with either party for a very long time, and that per se has not raised any objections. I can understand that there are some objections because of whether it's comprehensible. That, of course. But I don't think at this point one can object to the whole thing.
Right, I just meant he's asking questions. I'm not saying it was submitted late, if that's what you're asking me. My objection is not based on that. My objection is based on the fact that it's unintelligible, and by even if we accept that the transcript of the audio is a correct transcript, by it's now been blocked by whatever the person who just, if you can move that, by its very nature, it says there were at least 17 seconds of unintelligible recording, and then another 19 seconds, and then another 42 seconds, and then another 44 seconds. Nor do we have any way to confirm that that was actually the president speaking.
I think we would like to move on. I mean, we take it for what it is. I mean, and to the extent that is understandable and with the objections that have been raised, but has been as part of the record for quite a while. But given the limitations it has in itself, I think, and you have explored this theme also with press reports, etc. In the interest of time, also, I think it would be useful to move on.
Sure. May I just ask one question? That's the only question I want to ask him. Mr. Eichenhead, do you recognize during the broadcast I hear, could you recognize whether that was the voice of the President Bourget speaking or not?
No microphone. The use of the R might be him or somebody speaking with the same tone of voice that he uses.
All right. Now let me just ask you a few questions about the high-level Railroad Commission that you were appointed to oversee along with Commissioner Fernandez. Do you recall your testimony about that?
Sí, aquí está en el testimonio.
Yes, it's here in the statement. We were asked to participate, not necessarily to chair.
Your answer is no. Neither you nor Mr. Commissioner Fernandez actually ever attended any of the high-level commission meetings, correct?
Incorrecto.
Incorrect. Commissioner Fernandez did participate, and he participated in at least a couple of sessions. The first session, I'm sure he participated in it, and he pronounced the opening words. And at that time, and the others, he always stated the importance of coming up not only with a solution to a particular problem, but a solution to all of the problems, even if step by step the idea was to tackle the entire agenda of issues with ferrovías and with the rail system in Guatemala.
You didn't attend any of these meetings, correct?
Y creo que tal vez
I did not attend, that is correct, but you have to understand, just to see, it's impossible, there being all of these issues, for one to be present at all meetings. A deputy presidential advisor is basically the number 2 in the area that I was working in, and he was there. So since he was there, he had broad authority to negotiate. The only 2 limitations he had is that he could not enter into any agreement in those meetings that would imply fiscal resources without having previously had approval from the Economic Cabinet, or that would involve legal provisions without having had authorization by the Secretary General of the Republic. But he had my full delegation of authority to participate actively in those meetings.
You didn't attend any of the high-level commission meetings. The only knowledge you have about what was discussed, raised, proposed at these meetings is based on what others have told you or told you about them, correct?
en la etapa previo
Prior to the decision on lesividad, yes, I did participate, as I mentioned to the tribunal a few moments ago. After the signing of lesividad, when the study was carried out in the Mesoamerica case.
Excuse me, are you now saying that you did attend some of the high-level commission meetings prior to the declaration of lesividad?
no.
No, perhaps the translation was mistaken. What I said, and I'm going to say it slowly, was that I did not participate in the direct meetings of the high-level commission before the declaration of lesividad. After the declaration, the president asked me to continue to be involved in the issue, and I did meet with the local partners and representatives of Mesoamerica after the declaration of lesividad, not before.
You've never had any, during this entire time, either before or after the declaration of lesividad, you never met with anyone from Ferrovías, did you?
No,
Not in the context of the meetings of the high-level commission. Clearly, in some of the visits that have been made to the presidential house, I may have been present. At some meeting, someplace, I may have been present. But at those meetings of the high-level commission, I never participated in any of those meetings, as is reflected in the aide-memoirs of those meetings.
President Berger appointed you and Mr. Fernandez to oversee the high-level commission in March of 2006. It's true, is it not, that President Berger was already in receipt of FEGWA Overseer Gramajo's request to declare the equipment contracts lesividad, correct?
es correcto.
It is correct that in January of 2006, he received a request from Mr. Gramajo.
At the time the President formed the high-level commission, he was aware that there was a request from the FEGWA Overseer to declare the equipment contracts lesividad, correct?
El presidente,
The President, in response to that request, what he asked his Secretary General, and he commented this to me, was to undertake the legal studies to see whether the request by Mr. Gramajo in that regard was correct or was not correct. And as of January, it's my understanding those studies were made.
Limited amount of time. I just wanted you to answer my question. My question was, at the time President Berger formed the high-level commission in March of 2006, he was in receipt of the FEGWA overseer's request to declare the equipment contracts lesivo, correct?
Señor Presidente del Tribunal, solo quiero hacer
Mr. President of the Tribunal, I just have one observation. I'm trying to answer specifically. It seems to me that he should let me finish my sentences, but he is asking something concrete. I'm going to answer concretely. It is correct, as appears in the record, that Mr. Gramajo had asked the President to declare the contract lesivo in the month of January. That is correct. And it so appears in the document.
And it's also true that at the time you were asked to oversee the high-level commission in March of 2006, the President didn't inform you or Commissioner Fernandez about this request from Dr. Gramajo, did he?
de nuevo.
Once again, there are two distinct issues. One is the request to the President. Another is the moment when a decision was made as to how to proceed with lesividad. What Commissioner Fernandez, and in my case, myself, and in the instructions from Marroquin, the President did not inform us that there was a decision to declare the contract lesivo when we began the conversations. That is what happened. He did not tell us because there was no decision to declare the contract lesivo. What there was a request from the FEGWA overseer. They're two different things.
And isn't it a fact that you didn't learn about the President's decision to declare the equipment contracts lesivo until May of 2006?
Es correcto.
That is correct.
Don't you think it would have been important for the people participating on the high-level Railroad Commission to know whether or not there was an outstanding request to declare one of the Ferrovias contracts lesivo as part of their discussions?
I'm sorry, but you're trying to tie two things together. They were sitting down at the table in good faith, negotiating, and at that negotiating table, they found out that there was a process to seek an agreement with the ministers to declare the contract lesivo. They informed Commissioner Fernandez of this. He consulted with the President, and the President confirmed for him that the process was going on, but that if the negotiations were continuing forward, he was willing to suspend the process for the negotiations to go forward. And that's what happened. It was suspended until August in order for the negotiations to continue. That's what happened, and that's what my statement says.
That after the high-level commission meetings were suspended on May 11, 2006, the next negotiation session between the parties, the government and Ferrovias, was August 24, 2006, the day before the declaration of the lesividad had to be published.
No,
That does not mean that from May there were no further efforts and conversations, but meetings, for one reason or another, no longer took place. Meetings where everyone sat down together to discuss the issues. This wasn't a decision just of the government. It was part of the conditions and the things being said by each of the parties. But the intent continued, and there were personal contacts with some persons or contacts with parties. The Commission, as such, did not report having had any new official meeting.
You can't tell us of any discussions, whether they were face-to-face or by written communication or by telephone, that occurred between the government and representatives of Ferrovias between May 11th, 2006 and August 24th, 2006.
Como reunión
As an official meeting of the High-Level Commission, no. But from the reports we received, there were conversations, there were contacts between the parties. But as I tell you, since it wasn't me, or since I wasn't there, I couldn't tell you exactly what, whom, or how.
In your binder, which is at tab 3. Do you know what Exhibit C44 is? Well, let me ask you this question, and maybe we can move forward. Do you recognize Exhibit C44 as the settlement offer or proposal that the government presented to Ferrovias on August 24th, 2006?
tendría que revisarla con más detalle.
I'd have to look at it in more detail. If you give me some time, I can look over it and then give you an answer. But I can't read the entire document in just 2 minutes. I don't know what you prefer or how the tribunal would like to proceed.
You weren't at the August 24th, 2006 meeting between representatives of the government and Ferrovias, correct?
No.
No, I did not say in my statement that I was present because I'm not certain that I was there.
No, traté de hacer.
I tried to remember, see if I had any notes from being there. I didn't have anything, so I cannot say what I don't recall. I can't guarantee that I wasn't there, but I don't have any recollection of having been at that meeting.
Do you recall being at a meeting where the government presented Ferrovias with a proposal the day before the declaration on La Cividad?
De nuevo.
Once again, I recall the existence of that meeting. I was aware that the meeting occurred. I don't know if I was physically present because at that time we were having another economic problem that was major and that I had to deal with directly. Therefore, I cannot say that I was there on that date. Had we not been involved in the issue that we were looking at, and which involved a financial situation of banking institutions in the country, then I could recall whether I was there. But, as I say, I don't mention it because I know that that meeting happened, but I can't verify that I was there. It's most likely that I wasn't there because I don't remember it. But as I say, I can't assure you this of this 100%.
Okay, but you do know that the government presented Ferrovias with a written proposal on August 24, 2006, the day before the declaration of La Cividad had to be published, correct?
Sé que
I know that there was the utmost desire to reach an agreement and that work was underway on a proposal, but I cannot ensure you, as I say, that it was this. But if other persons from the government say that it was, then it was this.
Any reports about that meeting and what happened at that meeting?
As my statement says clearly, at paragraph, it says, my statement says that up until one day before the declaration, the government was trying to reach agreement. And the government had once again tried to reach agreement before the lesividad was declared. So I do know that some offer was being presented in order to try to reach an agreement.
Witness statement, and I'm referring to paragraph 6 in particular, you insist that the government's goal in its negotiations with Ferrovias was always to guarantee that Guatemala would have a working railroad, correct?
Ese era el objetivo.
That was the key objective of the whole process, that it be operative and that it extend to the Atlantic and to the Pacific.
The declaration of Lesivo that the government, that President Berger issued, was against Ferrovias' railroad equipment contract, correct?
En agosto.
In August of 2006, that is correct.
You would agree that if the government, as a result of the declaration of Lesividad, took the railroad equipment away from Ferrovias, FEG could not operate the railroad, correct?
Objection. That calls for a legal conclusion. The legal documents set forth the answer to that.
You rephrase the question?
Well, you would agree that if the declaration of Lesividad was upheld by the court, the government would then or have the right to take away Ferrovias' railroad equipment, correct?
Again, it calls for a legal conclusion.
I'm asking for his understanding.
He's not a lawyer. He's an economist.
Well, we've asked plenty of witnesses about legal documents that aren't lawyers.
Objection is sustained.
All right, well, you know that, Mr. Eichen, about a year after the declaration of Lesivo, Ferrovias stopped operating the railroad, correct?
Correcto.
Correct.
Since that time, there has been no working railroad in Guatemala?
Correcto.
Correct. There's not been a working rail service, but the concession continues in force.
Could you please explain to the tribunal how declaring the usufruct equipment contracts harmful to the interests of the state helped to guarantee that Guatemala had a working railroad?
Putting things in context, a decision on lesividad has to give rise to a contentious administrative proceeding, which has to be decided by the court. What a declaration of lesividad says is that that contract did not meet or comply with the country's legal rules for being able to operate and to be advisable for the Guatemalan state. So the fact that the declaration is issued, what that does is it makes that issue like the issue of FEGWA's non-payment, like the other issues that had been raised by Ferrovias and that the government wanted to talk about, it meant that one had to sit down at the negotiating table and reach an agreement, either an agreement between the parties or await the judicial resolutions. But there's just one part that's not clear to me about the question. In your previous question, you indicated to me that if they took the equipment from Ferrovias, isn't there any other equipment that might be able to be used to make the railway operational? Because I don't think that's the only wide gauge equipment that railway equipment that exists in the world, or might that be the case? So I don't know why a legal issue having to do with contract and equipment meant the impossibility of the contract going forward. I don't really know, see where your question is directed.
So just to wrap up, one more question. So if I understand your testimony, the government thought that by declaring the equipment contracts lesivo, it would force Ferrovias to negotiate with the government on all issues related to the railway. Isn't that right?
That is not what I said. What I said was that the purpose, at the inception, for President Berger was to try and solve the problems related to the operation that Ferrovias and FEGWA had, and to agree with the parties a plan to move forward with the rehabilitation of the railway and to make it possible for us to have an efficient railway system. In fact, in the Mesoamerica study, it was said that the state was ready to support the financing so that the narrow gauge could become a wide gauge. That was an issue that was still put in the negotiation table. But you were saying that the main objective of the government was not the termination of a particular contract, but rather to solve the problem, which was the lack of railway service in the country, both going to the Pacific coast.
Thank you. As you know, we have scheduled the sessions up to 6. We can proceed for a short while, and in that respect, so that we finish the examination of Mr. Eichenhead, the Secretary will inform us of arrangements in terms of transcriptions and so forth available after a certain time.
We may not have live transcripts in Spanish. I hope that's not a problem because we initially had arranged that to be provided until 5 o'clock. Our court reporter needs to leave at 6:30 to catch a plane, but I mean the rest of the days we will have live transcription services. So to the extent possible, like if we could finish by 6:30, but.
So,
Let's agree that we extend the session up to 6:30 and that we stop at 6:30.
that's agreeable.
Okay. And,
As I understand it, the questions of the lawyers following up after the panel's questions will be limited to no more than 10 minutes per side.
yes, of course, it's your turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Eichenhead? I think I just have questions about one issue. And I understand you said you were not aware of what offers went back and forth exactly to the T before the lesivo declaration was issued, but if the lesivo, if the government had proposed a, let's state it differently. Let me restart the question. if the government and Ferrovias had reached an agreement to, or could have reached an agreement before the Lesivo Declaration was published to cure the causes of the causes that led the government to issue the Lesivo Declaration and have it published, but had not reached a resolution of the other issues that the parties were discussing regarding Contract 402 and Contract 820, the trust fund agreement. Do you know whether the government would have been willing, under those circumstances, to stop the issuance of the Lesivo Declaration? In other words, the publication of the Lesivo Declaration.
The president had told us that he was willing to take risks of the non-publication of the Lesividad if there was an agreement as to how to proceed in that issue in particular, even though the other issues may have been left unresolved.
I have no further questions.
I understand your last answer, but I'm trying to square that with what you said in paragraph 11 of your statement, in which you indicate that there was an effort to reach an agreement that would provide for the cure of the legal defects of the equipment contracts and for a plan that would ensure the rehabilitation and functioning of the railroad. And you said twice now that the president wanted to have service both to the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, and that was the purpose of the negotiations. So can you tell me again, what did you understand, based on what you said in paragraph 11 and your statements twice, that the president wanted to achieve service in both the Atlantic and Pacific areas, the purpose of these negotiations under the high-level commission?
The high-level commission established very clearly 5 items that were important and that had to be dealt with. One was the claim by Ferrovias regarding the non-payment by FEGUA of certain canons that FEGUA had to pay. Second, a resolution regarding the lack of support by the government because of the squatters in the right-of-way of the railway. Third, a request by the government to solve the issue related to the legal defects of the equipment contract. Fourth, to try and find a joint resolution related to the railway and the viability of the railway. And 5, what would be the plan to extend the service and also to meet the agenda of the productivity plan up to 2015 to obtain railway services that went to the border with Mexico. Those were the 5 objectives mentioned by the president. Could we have reached partial agreements? Yes, according to certain issues, but the effort of the government was to try and solve the 5 of them. But at no time were we told you have to stop solving one if you cannot solve all of them. That was never told to me.
Okay, but you're saying that what you were seeking was a global agreement on these 5, if that was possible. That was the goal.
The ultimate purpose was that, although we could have had intermediate objectives.
The original contract 41 was concluded in 1999, and then the successor contracts 143 and 158, these were the equipment contracts, 2003. Do you know why there was a 3-year period in which Ferrovias was permitted to operate the railroad and use the equipment if there was a defect with respect to the bidding and the lack of a presidential or council of ministers signature? Is that something that you have any knowledge about?
I don't have knowledge, deep knowledge of the legal issues. I know that both in 99 and in 2003 there were mistakes and the contract was not perfected, but I don't have knowledge of that. I don't know why things were operational without the contract.
And were you part of the council of ministers in your very high position with the government?
During 2004 and 2008, yes, I was a member of the Council of Ministers, and I went to the economic and general cabinet meetings. The economic cabinet meetings were meetings where fewer people were involved.
I mean, the actual legal defects for 143 and 158 were, as you described, the lack of a public bid and the lack of a presidential signature. Why weren't those able to be solved, in your knowledge, within this 3-year period? They don't seem to be terribly difficult. The other issues, I understand, are very complex, but those two legal defects, can you explain to the tribunal why those couldn't have been promptly corrected?
A critical issue is the fact that in 99, the contract could have been perfected because there was a call for bids, and then Ferrovias won the other contract for the general usufruct of the railway. In that case, there was a call for bids, and the contract was not perfected. The error in 2003 was that the contract was made without a bidding process and without the approval of the Council of Ministers. In 2003, we should have made an agreement with Ferrovias for them to conduct a bidding process again of the equipment during the period stated by the government, and then if they had agreed, then the call for bids would have been established. Well, no one would have wanted to get an equipment for a railway that doesn't exist elsewhere in the country. So they would have won the call for bids. But in connection with Berger's administration, well, they accepted as good a process that had existed for 8 years from the original bidding date. But there was no agreement in that regard. If you allow me to give you a personal opinion, what I feel is that, regrettably, and this happens in negotiations, the parties were very aware of their legal options, and they were not as aware of their negotiation options, extrajudicial negotiations, if you will, and I think they should have pushed those more actively.
Why the bidding process, because you say that you assume that they would have won, why wasn't there an agreement simply to go through the formality of a bid, have the president sign it, and be done with that issue?
Basically, in my opinion, because there was never an agreement. Let me give you an example. I'm talking about other agreements related to other issues now that seem minor. For example, the historic heritage. Ferrovia wanted the administrative proceeding to be stopped and not to be restarted. In this case, it wasn't a legal process that was ongoing. And they did not want to stop the Ferrovías arbitration. Each party was looking at the risks that may have existed related to their vested rights, and there was no agreement based on trust. If that agreement would have existed, we would have advanced in the negotiation of the other issues, but unfortunately, we failed in that negotiation.
Thank you.
Any further questions on your side?
None.
Mr. Stein?
Yes, briefly. Mr. Aikenhead, when the government of Guatemala originally awarded the original equipment contract to Ferrovías, that was done pursuant to a public bid, correct?
In 1997, yes, there was a public bidding.
Put the public bid for the equipment contract, Ferrovías already had been awarded via another public bid the right-of-way usufruct, correct?
As I said, I wasn't a member of the administration at the time. I cannot give you the details. But they were awarded the general usufruct of the railway system. And then there was another trust agreement, and then you also mentioned another contract related to the usufruct of the equipment.
And at the time the government awarded or did the initial public bid for the equipment usufruct, the government did not first obtain Ferrovías' consent to put it out to a public bid, did they?
Sorry, but this is going beyond the scope of the questions from the tribunal.
I'm getting to the point of Secretary Eisenstadt's questions.
I believe it's beyond the scope.
I mean, I can cut to the chase if that'll move things along.
We sustain the objection.
Okay, well,
We think we are going beyond that, and he was not in government at the time. I mean,
okay, well. What I'm trying to understand is there was nothing that required the government to get Ferrovías' consent to put the equipment contract out to a new public bid once it realized that contract 143 and 158 had not been subject to a new public bid, was there?
I'm sorry, that calls for a legal conclusion and is beyond the scope of the questions that were asked by the tribunal.
Excuse me.
we again sustain the objection. It's on the same grounds. Those are legal questions. I mean,
With all due respect, he's answered numerous questions regarding his legal understanding of several documents in response to Mr. Horta's questions and to the tribunal's questions, and it's just a very simple question. He testified in response to Secretary Eisenstadt's questions that the reason they couldn't resolve or put the contract out to a new bid is because they had to negotiate that issue and consent from Ferrovías. And my question is simple. There's no basis for that statement.
It's an incredibly complicated question that calls on legal issues. We can ask the experts about it, and they've opined about it. I mean, to ask this person who's an economist is really out of bounds, and it's going to muck up the record.
just ask him a factual question as far as he knows. whether the consent of Ferrovias was required. I mean, just the question, frankly, is a bit, very legalistic and convoluted.
I will try again. You recall in answering questions from Secretary Eisenstadt that you said in order for the parties, for the government to put contracts 143 and 158, the equipment contracts, out to a new public bid, it required Ferrovias' consent. Do you recall that testimony?
Sorry, I have to protect the record here. That's not what the witness said. He was asked by Secretary Eisenstadt why he understood that the parties were not able to correct the two deficiencies after contract 143 and 158 were executed, and the witness answered that to his knowledge the parties were never able to reach agreement on the terms. That's a factual point. He's now asking a legal question, and I'm sorry, it's beyond the scope and it's not proper for this witness.
We are sustaining the objection.
All right, well, I have no further questions.
Mr. Aikenhead, no sé si pronuncio.
I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly or not, but I would like to thank you for being here this afternoon, and you can step down. Thank you. Good afternoon.